welcome everyone to this year's first installment of To Catch a Fraudster. I'm Tom Cronkright, one of the co-founders of Certified and executive chairman. And with a new year, we're bringing in more gritty and raw content for you and your teams and your communities to be able to not only learn from, to stay ahead of these frauds as they continue to advance with social engineering and some of the things that we're going to talk about in this series, but being able to kind of level up on how you're thinking about fraud prevention and security in general, especially as it relates to the transfer of funds. We're also kind of mixing things up a little bit on the format. So we're flipping this over to the YouTube format. Don't worry, you'll be able to fully interact and engage with us through YouTube chat. We're meaning this to be a very interactive experience, but we also want to make it convenient for you to have more portability and the ability to access and repurpose this content again to your teams, to your communities. Play this in a lunch and learn if you guys are working out discussions with your customers, referral partners, prospects around these topics. So with that, I'm joined today by Nate Stevens. Nate serves as the manager of fraud recovery services for Certified. Nate, you're an OG, and I'm glad to have you, man. So proud of what you've done for everyone, not just the company, but for everyone that you touch on a daily basis. So why don't you introduce yourself a minute, Nate, and then we'll dive in.
Yeah, hey everyone. My name is Nate Stevens. I manage, as Tom said, our fraud recovery services here at Certified. If you're not familiar with our fraud recovery services, we are partnered with the United States Secret Service to support victims of wire fraud. Some of you all in the audience may have worked with us previously to recover funds, but ultimately working with victims and our law enforcement partners to stop what you're going to see here today and ultimately return those funds back to those victims. So super excited to be here, and we have a really cool story to share.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to do. Well, I'll get to next month at the end. So let's dive in, Nate, you and I. This will be more of a fireside chat. So the session today titled, It's Not Personal, Housing Scams, the Criminal Transfer of Wealth. It's really a money muling story. We uncovered just an incredible story and documentation around a money mule that was wrapped up, got over his head, and then I would argue found religion, and then came forward with a lot of information that was helpful to prevent further crime. So first off, I want to talk about just kind of the size and scope. It's not going to be a surprise to hear that it continues to grow, both geographically and the scope of these enterprise scaled operations now. We have a story that Nate's going to run us through, who personally was kind of sitting right in the pilot seat, if you will, of this money mule scam that was uncovered. And then, as always, we'll pivot to say, okay, what does this mean for all of us? For those of you that might not be aware, there is a movement right now in the industry that's reframing what title and escrow companies do from insurance to consumer protection, to protecting the buyers and sellers and their life savings, to protecting the data and the integrity of their personal information. And everything that we're going to talk about in the series this year is going to be geared towards how are we best prepared to meet those demands. All right, so for questions, we're going to have a live session to answer questions in real time. Please put those in the YouTube chat, and we'll have a nice interaction as we go through the content today. We're going to start off by playing a clip. So Erin West, if you haven't heard the name, she's phenomenal. Former state prosecutor in California, really spent the back end of her career chasing down pig butchering or investment scam bad actors. And these are actors that are proposing to, hey, I got a crypto wallet and you can invest $50. And then all of a sudden, months later, you get these victims that are mortgaging their home and investing hundreds of thousands of dollars. She has since retired, launched Operation Shamrock, which is now a nonprofit that's meant to spread education and kind of create a consortium of stakeholders to try to prevent these bad actors from having the success that they have. So we're going to play this clip from Aaron West, and then we'll be right back with you.
These syndicates hold unprecedented power over the region. The U.S. Institute of Peace and the UN Office of Drugs and Crime have estimated that revenue generated by this criminal industry comprises more than 40% of the GDP of Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos. In Cambodia, this can be viewed as a state-run criminal enterprise with compounds owned by high-ranking officials. This disturbing status quo thrives on and will ultimately outwit a partial or disjointed international response. We lack a national strategy. We are siloed. As a nation, we have done very little to disrupt this criminal industry and to protect our citizens from the relentless threat that comes at them daily.
All right, unbelievable, right? The size and scope of what she's seeing. You can see how just the multinational texture and the call to action, like she hit that subcommittee right between the eyes saying we need to act, and we need to act now. Like we're behind this ball that's rolling downhill at an increasing velocity year over year. To back up what she's saying, let's just look at how cybercrime is shaping right now in the US. So cybercrime, all forms of cybercrime, wire fraud, ransomware, monetization of theft of data, romance scam, investment scams, $10 billion a year, which is reported. There's a bunch that's not reported, okay? So the number is actually much larger. In investment scams, or otherwise known as pig butchering, a lot of that's relating to cryptocurrency, is $2 billion. And then business email compromise, which we are closest to in real estate, otherwise known as wire fraud, is $500 million just in real estate. And those were stats coming from the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center last year. The other thing that's coming out are these raids on like cyber enslaved camps, hustle kingdoms. I mean, there's some things here. I just warn you, if you go down this rabbit hole, there's some things you're not going to be able to unknow. It's a very, very dark part of what's going on in the world right now, where in third world countries, they'll put what looks to be a legitimate ad for employment, hiring well-educated and experienced individuals, just trying to level their family and their community up. And they'll go for an interview, get put in a room. HR will come in asking for their passport and other form of documentation. They take that, and then the ruse is, comes to light when they say, we're not giving your documentation back, and you got to come with us, because they put them in these enslavement camps to run cyber crimes at scale. And they'll use just very inhumane conditions and tactics to get them to do what they need to do, full well knowing that they're scamming people. I only say that because it's so scaled. Like Myanmar and some of these other parts of the world, like they're building high rises right now for these types of operations in some of these military states. All right, now what we're here for, Nate, we're going to talk about Stan, our money mule, in a professional money mule. So I'll just say this and I'll hand it over to Nate. There's two worlds where people end up becoming a money mule. One, they're wrapped up into something that they don't understand themselves. They're in an online dating relationship or some type of friendship. They get solicited to help a nonprofit or some community, some force for good for their community. And behind the scenes, a bad actor is impersonating interest or an organization, and individuals, law-abiding citizens, get flipped into what are called unwitting money mules, okay? Those people typically are victims themselves. So when we recover funds and Nate finds accounts that goes into Jane Doe's checking account, and Jane Doe had already given money to this cause, she's a victim herself. Federal law enforcement kind of passes over that. But then there's those that know or reasonably should know they're engaged in unlawful activity. Okay, and those are witting or complicit money mules. And that's what we find ourselves in with the story of Stan. So with that, Nate, just tell me when to advance the next slide, and I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, so this is a story that we've been kind of packaging and shaping for you all, knowing that it's a peek behind the curtain, right? I've talked with hundreds of victims, very similar to yourselves, right? Title company owners, law firm owners, home buyers, home sellers, right? That have been impacted by wire fraud, and every one of them is looking for justice, right? How do we, is this person that received those funds going to be brought to justice? How can we support you in that way? Well, we're going to show you a little bit of the challenges behind that and what actually happens with your funds or these funds when they're stolen in a real estate transaction. As Tom walked through, right, these are incredibly well-organized groups. You are not up against somebody in the basement. I think we've used this analogy too many times now, but right, somebody in a basement on a computer typing away. You are up against international organized cybercrime syndicates. Right, and the level of complexity with how they move these funds, with the individual money mules that they convince or employ to move those funds is just fascinating. And again, we're going to give you kind of our first look behind the scenes here at an actual money mule and the way they move funds. So what we're going to break down for you, number one, we're going to shape the transaction, how it came across our desk. We're then going to show you the crime, right? How did these funds get transferred originally? We're going to follow the money. And really, truly show you what happens when funds from a real estate transaction land in a fraudulent account. And then we're going to talk about, as Tom mentioned, Stan's kind of coming to light moment and why he decided to come forward with this information.
Yeah, and I want to underscore, Nate, again, you introduced yourself, but I want to underscore this because you sit in this seat and run the team that is the first call that they're making on their worst day. Like, you're the tip of the spear for our fraud recovery services division. So I just want to underscore, Nate is dealing with victims and victim impact and victim intelligence around wire fraud on a 24/7 basis, because I get the emails as well. I mean, we know this is a 7-day-a-week job, right?
Yeah.
All right. So with that, I didn't mean to interrupt. Tell us about the transaction.
No, and I appreciate that, right? And again, this is really exciting for me to get to share with you all kind of what this looks like in the next step. Right, we all have heard wire fraud. I don't think anybody in our industry, is unrelated to this or doesn't understand the types of transactions that are targeted or the ways that fraudsters are, stealing the money and who they're impersonating. But this is going to uncover the challenges of recovery and really, again, kind of peek behind the curtain at how these funds are moving. So the transaction here, this was a home sale of a house in Fort Myers, Florida. The house you see here in the picture sold for just over $400,000 in August of 2024. The title company, also in Florida, came to me in September after having wired funds to a fraudulent account, and we're going to break that down for you. So how this fraud actually occurred, and some of you are going to be familiar with this fraud type. This was a mortgage payoff for $252,000. What happened is the seller received the settlement statement and forwarded over to the title company. Unbeknownst to the title company, their closer's email was compromised, right? And what happened is within that closer's email account, there were auto forwarding rules created. Rules that said, hey, any email with the word payoff in that email, delete it out of closer's inbox, forward it to Fraudster. Fraudster then manipulates the contents of the email, or in this case, manipulates the attachment, and then reinserts it in that closer's email. So from the title company's perspective, this looked like it came from the legitimate seller's email address, right? Includes phone numbers for validation, includes wire instructions. Nothing looks out of the ordinary. And so the title company takes this, calls the phone number on here, and validates those instructions. Well, what they weren't aware of and what they didn't catch is that this was altered, right? On the statement here, you can see two things. Number one, in the middle there in the seller line, Stan, our money mule, was added as a seller on this property. Okay, so Stan's added, and there's additionally a phone number provided for convenience to validate the instructions on this payoff statement, right? So again, everything looks legit. This comes from the right email, comes at the right time, just a 30-minute delay, and it has all the information for validating those instructions. So title company receives this and proceeds to wire $252,000 at the end of August to what happened to be a fraudulent account. Right, so this is where we're going to begin to follow that money.
I'll put my title owner hat. For those of you that don't know, I also own a large title agency in Michigan. what terrifies me about what Nate just said was this was a full email compromise of what we believe is the escrow officer's email account. Did I have that right, Nate? So
Correct.
they pull it out, they have the forwarding rules, they drop it back in, and it's not like this was an updated payoff. The new payoff sat in a pre-existing inbox, let's assume it was Outlook, and then they pick and pull that after closing and send it off. They run their verification, but the verification is saying, hey, the payee is different and the phone number is different, but they're not looking because they probably deleted the prior one in the string. This is unrelated to the other type of scam where they update it and then we're verifying and updated where something had changed. And I know this one's much harder to detect because it's sitting in the title company's inbox. So,
and what's fascinating about this specific title company, right? We're going to portray and kind of walk you through this $252,000 payoff. Because of that inbox being compromised, this title company in total lost over $700,000, right, across 3 or 4 different payoffs because they weren't able to catch it, right? It takes, about a month for a payoff fraud to be caught because that seller gets a message that, hey, this hasn't been paid off. They call the title company and say, what's going on? And then we finally identify it. But this is a lot different than some of the other fraud types where, same day or next day, hey, I didn't receive the funds I was anticipating. So this is just one of the transactions. And as Tom said, this vector of payoff fraud is incredibly challenging to identify and can be extremely damaging.
Well, I call it going back to the well. If they know there's a vulnerable, how many times, Nate, have we dealt with victims? We dealt with one. I won't name her, but she was on one of our sessions last fall, right? Where same deal. Hey, I just learned of a payoff. I go back to the last 6 months of payoffs or the last 90 days of payoffs, and what she thought was a single incident $300,000 issue was just under $1 million of exposed liability. We've had so many instances of that. If you don't take anything else away from this, when you uncover a fraud, especially mortgage payoff, you got to go back, you got to go up funnel. And I would argue you need to verify and make sure everything's settled like the last 90 days on payoff. Yeah. Like there will be likely something in there. So, all right, Nate.
Absolutely. Yeah, let's walk through the money, right? So Stan receives the $252,000, right? Title company sends out the payoff. It goes to Stan's fraudulent bank account. Well, let's start with the bulk of the transaction and the bulk of the funds that Stan distributed, right? So Stan is instructed upon receiving that $250,000 to first send out 4 cashier's checks to 3 individuals, right, to launder these funds to additional money mules. So we've got Dennis in Indiana. He receives 2 checks for $35,000. Karen in Michigan receives $65,000. Karen was very quick to cash that in about 12 hours, we found out. And then we've got Theodore in California, and Theodore receives a check for $75,000, right? So this is the initial transaction, right, to chop this up, move it to the next account, again, laundering these funds. And I want to dive into Theodore here because this is probably the highlight and the star of this story and really, again, helps frame who these money mules are, right? Tom walked through, there's witting and there's unwitting money mules. And Theodore here is a witting money mule.
Now, remember, Stan was instructed by somebody to send $75,000 to Theodore. I want to be very clear. So Stan's our initial money mule, and then he's essentially following instructions on, like Nate said, bust this thing up into packets. These happen to be cashier's checks. Sometimes they're crypto wallets. Sometimes they're gift cards. Sometimes they're subsequent wire transfers. But yeah, Theodore would essentially be the second leg down on the money mule chain.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the reasoning that toward the end of why they're laundering the funds in these ways and the challenges that law enforcement face due to this type of movement of money. But right, Theodore's our money mule number 2, right? The second degree money mule. So Theodore's home address, 27043 Drive, right? That's his home address. However, Theodore instructs Stan to send the check to a different address right down the road, right? Send it down the road. I'll pick it up there. Well, why is Theodore is hiding this activity, right? Theodore is one of our witting money mules who is hiding his money mule activity from his wife. Unfortunately for Theodore, Stan makes the mistake of actually sending this check to his home. And it turns out Theodore's wife, Michelle, is home, and she's the first one to grab this check. Right? So Michelle grabs this check for $75,000, asks her husband, Theodore, why did we get this? Theodore looks at her and says, I don't know. I don't know why I got this. I don't know why my name's on this check for $75,000. I'm assuming Theodore has had some really great bonuses in the past couple of years, but he decided to kind of cover this one up and say, hey, I don't know why we got this. So this is Theodore's wife. Received this random $75,000 check from Stan, has no clue why it's there, and being the good citizen, the good character that she is, unknowing that her husband is a completely different actor, writes void across this check, and then writes this letter back to Stan and sends this check back to Stan saying, hey, I've enclosed this cashier's check. I have written void across it so it can't be cashed. Please let me know when you receive it so I can stop worrying about it. I would really like to know how you got our name, address, and how a mistake like this could have occurred. Right? Absolutely fascinating. Tom, I see you smiling. This is, again,
it's absolutely fascinating. It's because it's like in anything, there's always human error, right? So Happy Path, 75 grand, they're running the play, and you're just kind of like a digit off, like 27043, 27037. Do we know, is that like his buddy's house? Or was he sitting on that? Because that's what they'll do. They'll sit on another mailbox or porch. They'll wait for delivery, and then they'll quick grab it.
Yeah, we don't know in this case, but assuming one of those methods, right, trying to, at a minimum, hide this from his spouse. Yeah.
Yep. No, I think it's, one, love Michelle already.
Yeah.
Don't know her. But I think it just creates this, like, how human this all could be. Look, I'm a wire fraud victim. It became really human in the Cronkright household when I had to testify for the Department of Justice. Like, this is a piece of it, and I love the fact that, you know, he just pivots like, I don't know, what are you talking about? So, all right, what happens next? I can't wait.
Yeah, right. So again, just to keep the story on track, right? Stan receives $250,000, cuts it up in 4 cashier's checks. Theodore received his check. His wife grabbed it. And was able to send that back, right? So we're still talking about some of the laundering of funds. Well, we're 5 weeks out of the closing, right? Stan has received the $252,000, and he decides to call the title company to share that he was the recipient of this fraudulent wire. We'll talk about that coming to light moment here in a minute. But Stan decides to come forward and share the fact that, hey, I received these funds, and this was a fraudulent wire transaction. Stan's explanation, right? We talked about unwitting money mules. We talked about witting money mules. Stan's taking the stance of, hey, I was unwitting in this case. I have this friend. Her name is Morgan, and she instructed me to receive these funds and distribute them for her. Right? And Stan goes on to explain that Morgan is a TikTok influencer with 2.5 million followers. Right? 2.5 million followers of TikTok, and he's frequently moved money for her. Right, over the past 4 years, he's been moving funds similar to this transaction here in the same way, taking the funds in, chopping them up, sending them to people that he's instructed to do so. His explanation, and this is a direct quote from Stan, in order to hide income from her management company, she's using Stan to distribute these funds to dozens of other actors. Right, so if you can't tell, I'm not convinced he's unwitting, but this is his story, right? And Stan also shares that, this isn't the only person he's doing this for, right? Morgan's one of several, and he performs these services for people who don't want to deal with banks, who need to send money overseas, or they need to buy Bitcoin and simply don't know how, right? So Stan's explaining here, hey, title company, I didn't know what I was doing, right? I received this money. I'm going to come out here and tell you exactly what happened and share my story of why I'm not at fault for this transaction, right? I'm unwitting. So in addition to the checks that he was instructed to send, right, we still got a remainder here. Stan takes his cut, right? Very unwitting of him to take $14,000 from this transaction and send it to his personal account over 2 transactions. Additionally, Morgan instructs him to send out almost $25,000 via Cash App to a number of wallets here, and you can see the breakdown there. So right, not only are they chopping them up via these cashier's checks, sending them around the country, we have multiple transaction types out of this one account, right? So Cash App has been very frequently used and been brought into the news here. And Tom, if you want to jump forward, we can talk about that and then how this is being used by money mules to continue to launder funds.
Yeah, this Telegraph Silk Road founder was in the news a couple weeks ago, potentially being let out of prison. But you're right, unfortunately. And the same thing with crypto. And I'm not indicting crypto, but
yeah,
some of these alternative ways to communicate in these alternative, I guess, rails of payment optionality. Cash App's like a peer-to-peer. Bitcoin is obviously cryptocurrency. They're coming under scrutiny because of the lack of what I would say like common sense visibility into, hey, I built this thing, I built the peer-to-peer payment system, but it's used for nefarious purposes. So the founder's kind of in the crosshair now with, okay, you either know or you should have known. We need more guardrails around this. Same thing with, like I say, with some of these other technologies. I think the founder of Telegram was arrested in France a couple months ago because that's how they're communicating on an encrypted basis through these scams. So, all right, what happens next, man?
Yeah, and just to riff on that, right? It's not to indict the communication platforms or the funds transfer platforms, right? It's just the nature of this type of crime, right? And this type of laundering, and you're seeing this on a global scale, right? You heard Aaron, you heard us talk about it and kind of outline one of those fraud rings that was caught. This is impacting every nation around the world, right? We see regulation popping up in the UK, in Australia. You see, on Capitol Hill, a number of people being called to testify about this problem. So we may be behind it now. It's moving in the right direction, but right, this is a global scale crime, and just didn't want to underscore that. So want to talk about Stan's coming to light moment. How did we get this information, right? Why did Stan decide, you know what, I'm going to come forward after 4 years of transacting on behalf of Morgan? Well, some weeks after the closing, right, I think it was about 5 weeks, Stan went into his bank to send out one last transfer of $8,500, right, to one final person that Morgan instructed him to do so. His bank would not allow him to send it out of the business account, right? For whatever reason there, and unbeknownst to him, is very likely flagged, but right, they would not allow him to send it out of his business account, so he transferred it to his personal account, went back to the bank, and attempted to make that final transfer. Well, at the bank, in person, standing there in front of a teller, he goes to send the $8,500. Somebody taps on his shoulder, turns out it's bank security, and notifies Stan that they are investigating the initial $252,000 transaction that he previously received. He's not going to be able to send out this transaction because they believe and ultimately know that he's part of a larger wire fraud scam. And this is, again, Stan's coming to light moment. This is when Stan probably starts to shake in his boots, right? He's been doing this for years, and he's finally confronted, in addition to receiving that check sent back from Theodore's wife, right? This all starts to come to fruition, and I think he started to really feel the pressure. So, yeah, that's Stan's coming to light moment and why he elected to bring this out to the title company. Stan then, again, kind of unraveling the story and backing up his unwitting position of hey, I didn't know what was going on. He immediately begins to try to contact Morgan and ask her, hey, what's going on? Why am I getting told that this is fraud? What I forgot to tell you is Morgan actually also has a debit card on Stan's account. That was a fascinating part of this, right? Morgan's very involved in this 4-year relationship. 4-year relationship with this individual he never met in person that he also provided a debit card to, right? So he contacts Morgan. He starts to reach out to the recipients of the cashier's checks to try to get them back to say, hey, I'm the good guy. I'm going to help this title company out, right, to help protect himself. And then he also contacted the title company. I was privy to about 10 hours of phone calls between Stan and the title company as he shared his story and provided all of this evidence. He also shared additional contact details, phone numbers, to show more or to outline who Morgan was and why he was being told to do so. So that's kind of the story of Stan, right? And how we acquired this information. Again, we wanted to break this down for you. Everybody here is aware of mortgage payoff fraud, is aware of buyer cash to close fraud, seller impersonation, vacant lot. All of these scams are top of mind for you all. But what you don't know is the back end, right? How these funds actually get laundered and the challenges that this causes for federal law enforcement or for any law enforcement agency to prosecute. Right, as I mentioned earlier, every victim that I work with, the hundreds of victims we work with a year to recover funds, whether they're successful in getting those funds back or not, wants justice, right? Wants to see the individual that received those funds go to prison, some action taken against them. But ultimately, that's extraordinarily challenging. And Tom, I'll let you kind of kick things off here with, what will happen to Stan? What does this landscape look like for money mules like Stan when, they either out themselves or they're caught by law enforcement?
It's hard, and I don't have police power. I'm not a member of federal or state law enforcement. I was a victim, and it got pretty close now with our Secret Service partners in D.C., but also the investigative team by the Department of Justice in the trial I was involved with. And there's just so much scale to this. There's so many money mules, and it's almost like in some areas they don't have time to even interview all of them. It's happening that much. Here's a guy, think about this, over a series of years, right? I mean, think this wasn't his first time. And the other thing that's interesting about Stan is, like, he actually believed he had some connective tissue to this social media influencer. Whether that was a friendship, whether that was a business relationship, whether that was a romantic relationship, they actually believe it. And I would say, on the scale of, are you a witting money mule or an unwitting, Stan certainly knew what he was doing, right? And there's no way, and he was financially compensated for it. We hear heartbreak stories of people that are on the other end of the spectrum that have lost their life savings, then get flipped into money laundering. I don't know. It's going to depend on the state or federal prosecutors. I am encouraged, though, that when a situation like this becomes federal because it's crossing state lines and it's it's national wire transfers, I think there is more activity than we've seen before of the federal partners kind of priming a state prosecutor to look into this and maybe take a state action versus a federal action. Let me frame it on my case. $180,000 lost as a title company. No interest by the Department of Justice in prosecuting or even looking into a single incident loss. And that was in 2015. What was under the nose of the U.S. attorney was a $5 billion conspiracy that would take 2 more years to uncover. Then they were interested in what I had to say. Then they were interested in taking down what was that syndicate. So again, I'm not saying it's over for Stan, because in our trial, 33 convictions.
Yeah.
So my hope is that Stan will one day have to stand account for what he did.
Yeah, and on that, right, it's not a matter, on the federal side especially, it's not a matter of not wanting to, right? If we think about the prosecution, I just want to be clear, right? It's not a matter that they don't want to support. It's a capacity issue, number one. But also when you think about this, right, Stan's a money mule. Sure, Stan has moved likely millions of dollars over 4 years. I think Stan is in a bad position. His story is not going to stand up, right? But the challenges federal law enforcement and prosecutors face is there's 100,000 Stans out there, right? 20,000 Stans, whatever that number is, right? And ultimately, capturing Stan, sending Stan to prison, giving him a fine won't stop this problem, right? And that's their goal, is to prevent this from happening in the first place. And so, prosecuting a money mule that's one-off, whether it's Stan or somebody that's just received their first money mule funds, right, is not the goal. It's going upstream, finding that, kingpin actor, that big actor. Like you said, it took 2 years and $5 billion of losses to actually get to that individual. There is somebody upstream that if you do capture, if you do prosecute them, it cuts off the flow of funds, but it's very challenging to do so from the bottom up. You really do have to, whether it's converting a money mule to be cooperative with law enforcement, tracking data, tracking funds, those are the challenges that they face. So I talk about that, right? Every victim wants to see the justice. It's just extraordinarily challenging to have a one-off justice case. And like you said, it often takes culmination of multiple frauds against an individual for them to be prosecuted.
But we still need the reporting, because that reporting
Absolutely.
creates telemetry to say, okay, there is a broader conspiracy. And once the investigators can paint that to the prosecutors the prosecutor agrees and approves to move it forward, then the resources open up for the true, like, okay, this is a case now. That's what I've learned. So I agree with you, Nate. These guys bleed, our law enforcement partners bleed this issue. I mean, it breaks them sometimes to say, it's right here, but it's just not enough to go the distance on this one. Let's get as much as we can. So again, why do we need to care? There's a ton of equity, guys. We're going to have a repeat this year of what we had the last couple of years from likely the number of transactions, interest rates, right? But we're also going to continue to see price appreciation. If you look at the stats, most first-time home buyers are receiving a backfill from somebody, mostly their parents, to kind of right-size the mortgage rate. And there's still 20 to 25% of all transactions are taking place in cash. So there's still just an absolute ton of money moving within the real estate sector when the refinance activity starts to kick in and that equity is unlocked and monetized through new mortgages and cash outs. We'll see yet another wave of cash out refinance fraud. But they're preventable. So let's kind of flip. Anything else to add, Nate? Otherwise, let's kind of flip into what do we do with this? So, Nate, great job painting that picture of how quickly and how coordinated you said, hey, somebody got a check and cashed it like that day, like an echo. Like, I'm just going to, I'll open this FedEx right at the teller. Here, deposit it, right? And that's what we see. And it gets to the idea that everything was set up in advance of receipt of the wire. The whole playbook was baked. And it was just a methodical execution of it. So we all play a critical role. And I think this is the year, the industry needs this to be the year that we recognize this as a consumer protection issue. So you could say, okay, well, the title company was victimized. The title company was victimized in this case. But at the end of the day, the seller's mortgage was not paid off. And the transaction may not be fully consummated, even though the buyer's funds came in and out of the escrow account. That's an everybody's problem. And the weight of that will not be erased on the consumer's shoulders, both the buyer and the seller, even though the title company was the target of the fraud. We can't lose that, even though mortgage payoff, you'd say, well, that's a title company problem. It's an everybody's problem. Client communication. So how we're thinking about this now is unapologetically going to market, saying these are risks, the risks face everyone, and here's what to be aware of. Almost like a right to know or, a consumer message out there. Identity verification sits at the core of all this. Whether you're using our Payoff Protect product to validate the identity and the credentials of the mortgage servicer or the mortgagee being paid off, or the identity of a vacant land or unoccupied property seller through Match, or through anybody receiving a disbursement through one of our confirm or collect features. Identity sits at the crux of all of this because the root cause is social engineering. Somebody is just impersonating somebody else. The actual mortgage lender got impersonated with an updated payoff and a handwritten phone number, right, that Nate showed. And then also know that incident response plays a really critical role. I think we all have to live in a world where it's like not if, but when. We're doing everything we can to mitigate. We could all get hit with ransomware. We could all get hit with an email breach. We could all get hit with a phone call that somebody didn't follow our instructions, notwithstanding everything that we did to protect them. And you have to have an incident response plan to back that up. If you're not aware of what we can do from a fraud recovery services side, reach out to one of our representatives like Nate or others. The client communication. I think we need to do also a better job of understanding what the why is behind the transaction. And if there's something that seems tilted or off, then let's just call that out. Ask some more questions. And then be part of a regular dialogue with employees and with our referral partners about what we're seeing and some of the risks. We have a bunch of infographics and consumer resources that we can provide and do provide all of our customers just to help backfill the narrative that, look, This isn't a Michigan problem or a Florida problem or a Texas problem or a Missouri. It's an every corner of the country problem. And no matter if you're a small or large company, if it's a small or large transaction, it's all agnostic. Your number gets picked, they're going to come, and it really has to do with what we're talking about, the education, the preparedness, all of that. Identity verification. I would say if you haven't looked at the vulnerabilities in the workflow and maybe some of the assumptiveness, if that's a word, that you may take into just sending a notary out for signature or having somebody come in cold to a closing room, like we just can't, with all the technology, or firing up a RON and we think we're dealing with the actual seller. We have to authenticate that the identity of the individual and the credentials that they're presenting are such that can be trusted. It's both. Is Nate Nate, and is he presenting credentials that are actually issued by a federal or state authority? We have a really good flow that we'll provide here on identity verification. And that's what we see more than anything on like root cause. Fraud recovery services, be prepared. You don't want to be in crisis to think through how to manage crisis. You need all of that built up in advance. Who's going to run the fraud recovery services play or the incident response play? Who do I call in what sequence? Your buyers and sellers, you have to assume they're not aware about wire fraud. It's a fairly nuanced thing, still kind of new in the industry, even though we've been dealing with it for about 10 years. But they wouldn't identify that their funds are at risk unless they're notified and they're read into it. And the courts are saying we have to do that now. Reportafraud.org, if you're aware or you hear of or learn of, that's how you can report a wire fraud scam that has taken place and really engage our team to help mitigate that down. Reaching out, certified.com. I mean, we have a whole team. We're bleeding this on a daily basis. Nate, you want to add anything on the fraud recovery services, especially last year, trends or anything that you've seen that kind of stand out?
Yeah, I'll give you kind of the main pitch I say at the end of every presentation. I hope I never have to speak with any of you, and I mean that in the best way possible. But know that we're here, right? There's a number of resources you're going to engage. Include us as one. We're here to help, whether that's yourself or your home buyer that is victimized, right? Put us in your list on your IRP, save our number, put it on the fridge in the office. We're there to help. On the trend side, right, these fraudsters, they're moving, right? As soon as you put up a fence, they walk around it and find the next way into the house, right? So mortgage payoffs aren't going anywhere. I think the fraud that we outlined here, where a compromised system led to multiple frauds, is one that I'm seeing quite often, and very frequently starting out in 2025, high value home buyers. I've had multiple $1 million transactions where home buyers wired away. One was 2.3, the other was 1.4. They're being targeted, right? They know that is one of the most challenging frauds to prevent because you are not in the middle of those communications. They impersonate you, target your buyers directly, right? So again, it's going to continue to evolve. I'm sure in the next year, 2 years, we're going to see a new fraud scam pop up, and we're going to have to change process and change approach, but you just have to be ready for that, right? And continue to develop your systems, develop your security posture, keep your team informed, stay abreast of changes, log into webinars like this to anybody that's providing information on what's coming, what's new, and again, just keep yourself educated and also educate your customers.
No, great recap. So with that, thank you for, again, attending this year's kickoff to Catch a Fraudster. Nate, as always, man, appreciate you, and thanks for the texture and the information, and just unpacking it in a way that you could really you did a great job just walking through this. So we'll sign off, and we'll see you guys next month. Take care.